welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us again today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And today we are continuing with chapter 53, I believe. Let's see here. Yeah, 53. So, a lot in this one. So let's go ahead and jump in and get this started. Having some knowledge when walking the great Tao only brings fear. So this opening line has been translated a couple of different ways. One of the things that's been interesting to note in looking at the different translations I was going through in commentaries is there's a phrase here, and we've come across it at least once before, great Tao. In Chinese, it's fun because the word for great is da, so it's da Dao. It sometimes is picked up as a significant term, and other times it's just kind of ignored and either translated as just Tao, or in some cases, as we'll see here, Tao is taken in more of a I don't want to say literal sense, but in the sense of like a road or a path, the great path or the great way. And there's good reason for looking at it that way. But one of the things I've noticed is that this is a little bit more of a technical term that isn't always picked up on. So we're going to explore that a little bit. One of the other things to be aware of when looking at this last line, only brings fear. This one, again, kind of flows in a couple of different directions, but one of the other more prominent ways of translating it is something along the lines of the only fear I have is leaving or not following the path or the Tao or the way. So having, so in one sense, it's kind of like having at least a little bit of knowledge about this great Tao. It gives me concern about not veering off the path. Would be one of the ways that this opening line has been taken. But I want to look at this a couple of different ways. So one is, if there's a limited amount of knowledge, the other way this could be understood is that that tiny bit actually causes us concern because we understand something about this great way, but it doesn't sit well. It causes some concern as opposed to potentially someone who had a much more fuller understanding. So I kind of like the direction that that leads, and maybe we'll explore that here a little bit. But before we go too much further down that road, I want to explore what is meant by the great Tao. And this is the characters again, Tao. And this isn't as in Daodejing. This is like D-A as opposed to D-U-H, which might be the way you'd pronounce da in terms of Daodejing. So Chad Hansen is a scholar who's written extensively on this issue of the great Tao and where it comes from. So I'm going to start with a quote from him. He says, in the Taoist account, Shen Dao used the notion of great Tao to refer to the actual history of everything, past to future. Thus, he drew the conclusion that we simply will follow the great Tao, and that it makes neither conceptual nor normative judgments. So that last part about conceptual normative judgments is in reference to the great Tao. It's not something that has a bias or is making a judgment about good or bad. It's impartial in that sense. But what's key here is he's talking about a path or a Tao that includes everything. And again, this past to future. And it's simply something that we are going to follow. We don't really have a choice. So some of the debates in the early, 100 schools of thought during that Warring States period, when all these various Taos were being presented, was that there was a desire to show how the Tao of each of the particular schools of thought was actually justified by nature. And so one of the things that Shindao does is to show that a lot of these other Taos that are being proposed, whether we're talking about Confucius or any of the other major thinkers, is that they are more subjective, that they are just different ideas that these people are coming up, but they're trying to justify them by tying them to nature. And he says, let's back off a second here, because really the great Tao is if we've talked about the different patterns that are possible in nature, and in a certain sense there's no way to be unnatural, right? Because if you can do it, then it's by definition it's something that's natural. There's no way to do anything unnatural. So he's really pushing back on some of these other justifications for trying to show why their particular Taos were important. And really, it gets at one of those fundamental concepts at the beginning of the Daodejing, which is suggesting that if it's a Tao that can be followed in the sense that you have the option to follow it versus not follow it, this can't be the correct Tao. That they're taking it above that level of human interaction and the proposed Taos for how to be, and suggesting again that there's this larger, more cosmic pattern that we're all subject to. And so Chad Hansen has suggested that Shindao is really the first of the thinkers in what has become thought of as the school of Taoism, and that the Daodejing is really expanding on or running with this idea that initially is kind of brought forth by Shindao. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of written material from Shindao that was preserved. There's only some fragments. And one of the interesting routes that this goes is, one of the schools of thought is what's called legalism. And Shindao falls in that camp typically. And it has to do with the connection he sees between how the law is addressed from this great Tao perspective. So the idea is that if heaven is in fact this impartial thing in terms of nature, then if we're going to look at how we do laws within culture, they also have to be impartial, and they have to be implied evenly. And if we don't do that, then it's going to create social chaos, because there'll be discrepancies between those who benefit from it and those who don't, and those who are subject to it and those who don't, as well as the concern for personal gain of those who are in positions of rulership. So we're going to explore this a little bit further. But the other concern that comes up is, if we're talking about patterns that are essentially accounting for everything, that leads to some interesting conclusions. I want to show a quote here from another early writer. Now, when he says the way, this is also in reference to the Tao here. It says the way consists in straightening oneself and awaiting fate. So fate is a little bit of a tricky word in terms of what does this mean? Because we can maybe have some ideas that fate has to do with somebody controlling or directing, that there's some type of entity that's trying to keep things or make things happen in a certain way. Really, what's happening here with the idea of fate is anything that's not under your control that happens to you is this idea of fate. So again, the way consists in straightening oneself and awaiting fate. The arrival of fortune is not because one has sought it, so do not brag about its achievement. The arrival of misfortune is not because one has created it, so do not regret its course. Therefore, those who comprehend the way are not confused, and those who understand fate do not worry. So, even though they're not using the kinds of terms that we might use in more of a modern context, we see really kind of the same struggle that we end up with the concept of determinism, in that things are unfolding according to this cause and effect, and that cause and effect goes way back beyond, any individual. And so that really changes the way we can think about either merit or blame in this sense. And this is being expressed here in very similar terms. And as a consequence of this, there were a couple of different reactions, and they're remarkably similar to the types of reactions we get today if we're talking about determinism. And so one of those is apathy. What does this mean? If everything is determined, or if everything's unfolding according to these particular patterns, then why does it matter what I do? Why should I do anything? Why don't I just sit back and just let it all unfold? The other is kind of the exact opposite in terms of trying to push back against this idea of determinism, or that there's these grand patterns that are kind of controlling everything. And so there's this attempt to take over and try to make things happen according to one's desires. And then the third option then is, how do we conform to what these patterns are, and how do we adapt according to them? And this is along the lines of how I've talked about learning as the solution to the problem of free will, that free will doesn't actually make a whole lot of logical sense, in the sense of being able to decide something that's independent of your genetics or of your history or of your experiences. That really what we want is our decisions to be a result of all of those things. And this would be where that conform and adapt comes into play, is it's trying to understand what the patterns are, and then how do we work with those patterns. And this is actually the key, I think, to understanding or thinking about determinism, is that where it at first seems like this cage or this constricting thing that prevents us from being able to do anything, it's actually the fact that these patterns exist that gives us any possibility, one, for learning, to be able to see what those patterns are, which gives us the ability to some degree to predict how things are going to unfold. But it also gives us a key into where we can actually affect change by working with the way these patterns operate. And this is really the benefit then, is how do we learn and take advantage of what we learn, and how we adapt to and conform to these larger patterns that we find ourselves within. Are you following with me so far on where we're going on this? Okay. So I want to look at a couple of examples of how this gets played out then. So we're dealing with an agrarian culture. And within that, I want to look at the benefit of a calendar. So we use calendars a little bit different in our modern world if we're not involved in agriculture, in the sense that we organize events and keep track of our schedules and so forth. But if we're living in an agrarian culture, calendars have a very important role, which is to understand the seasons and how we deal with the cultivation of our crops that we need for survival. So if we think about where a calendar comes from, then it's initially going to be a lot of careful observation. So imagine there wasn't a calendar, and you're starting essentially from scratch to figure out how do we how do we keep track of all this? I mean, obviously there's days and night and day that we can observe, but then we can start to notice that there's various seasons that we go through. And in order to know when those seasons are happening, or what are the signs of these different things, and how they unfold, there's going to be obviously things we experience in terms of the weather changing, and the length of the days is going to change. But we might also notice that the positions of the stars start to move. And so there was a great deal of effort spent on trying to understand all of these patterns, and to put them together in a way that we could actually map it out. And this must have been just a tremendous undertaking. I can't imagine what it must have been like to try and notice when the stars are in a different position, especially, very early on when you don't have things like telescopes. So I don't even know how they would map them, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever gone out on a very clear night and looked up, but a lot of us are impeded in our ability to see the stars because there's a lot of light pollution that happens that clouds it for us. But if you find yourself in a place that's relatively dark and you look up, it is very impressive. I mean, it's one of those things that will make you feel small when you look out and you see everything so far away, and thinking that each of these stars is just, the size of our sun, and even some of the things that look like stars are actually galaxies. How did they do this? Well, I don't know, but there was a lot of very careful observation and paying attention to the patterns that allowed them to come up with a calendar. And that calendar then allowed them to start to do things like predict, so that they could start to plan when do they need to get ready for planting, when is harvesting coming, and all of this then allows them to structure more of an agricultural culture in such a way that they can be very effective by having a good understanding of these natural patterns and what to do at what time. And one of the ways they would look at this, well, remember the phrase Tian Di, which is heaven and earth. And this would be another way of essentially saying the universe, or the cosmos at a very large level, talking about the entire environment. There was sometimes this triad that is presented in terms of there's heaven, there's earth, and there's people. And how do these three work together? Well, this idea of the calendar, or in some sense recognizing these patterns, then would be a way of moving into harmony with heaven and earth. And heaven and earth are seen then almost like allies that are coming together in our ability to do what we're doing in terms of, in this case, agriculture. We would be acting in harmony with that. Another way that this could then be seen is that, in a sense, you could say that heaven is on your side. This isn't because you've somehow manipulated heaven, but it's more in the sense that you're understanding the patterns of heaven and you're working in conjunction with that. Again, because it seemed as though the change of the stars up above was affecting what was happening down below, there was thought that there was some type of connection between these two, that there was some kind of cause and effect between that changing in the heavens and what happens on earth. And this is where they would have this idea of heaven controlling what's happening on earth, but not in the sense of heaven as a deity, but more in the sense that there was some type of relationship between these things that could be understood and followed in terms of these patterns. So for a lot of the thinkers during this period, heaven is very much naturalized. It's not a deity that's involved, but it's more of these patterns that they're recognizing in the natural order of the world. It wasn't all of them, but it was a good majority of them. So then you've got an issue. So if, let's say, you're the leader of your community and you're helping to direct the efforts for how we get ready for, planting and harvesting and all those different activities that are involved, excuse me, in an agricultural setting. If for some reason I get some personal ideas that are not in keeping with the calendar, but I think I somehow know better, or I think I can do a better job, then this is going to lead to suffering. Because if those patterns are unfolding in a particular way and I'm not observing that, I'm not following that, I'm going down a different road, then this is going to lead to a loss of crops, which is going to lead to suffering of the people and so forth, which would then bring on this idea that heaven is no longer on your side. And so, at least from a leadership perspective, the goal is not to come up with clever ideas. The idea is, how do you follow, right? It's much more of kind of an office that is recognizing these patterns and how do I follow the patterns, rather than how do I take advantage of my own unique skills and abilities to try and come up with something that is unique. And this is a bit different than how we normally think of leadership. We normally think of leadership as, somebody's got special skills, they know what's going on, and they're providing unique energies and ideas. And here it's almost exactly the opposite. You want somebody who's not, in a sense, thinking for themselves. So if we take this and think about it from the society perspective, then the cultivation of people, we could think like how we're trying to cultivate plants, is going to have patterns that are associated with that. And so, again, this idea of these careful observations of trying to understand what is the nature of people, how do they react, what allows them to thrive and to really flourish and to not be in conflict with one another. These are going to be the patterns, kind of like a calendar, that the ruler is going to need to follow in order to have a successful society where everyone is, thriving and productive and working within the system. So, this idea, then, if we go back to that Shen Dao concept, is this is where the idea of law needs to come into play. Law is meant to be structured in society in such a way that it is mirroring what we're seeing in terms of these natural patterns. And it needs to be very impersonal. It needs to be indifferent. No one can be above the law. If that's in place, then things would happen in this harmonious way in conjunction with how things happen in heaven. And so then we have this idea of the mandate of heaven. And this can sound, again, like you have some type of deity that's controlling things, but this isn't really what's happening. It's more the idea that there's patterns in the universe, and when we follow those, we are in harmony with heaven, and we're following, in a sense, that mandate. Then we have the same problem. If the ruler is involved in some type of personal agenda, if he's there for his own benefit, if he is showing favoritism to his family or his friends, if the law is not applied evenly, then the consequence is going to be suffering, to the same degree that if you don't follow the calendar in the planting cycle, you're going to bring about suffering because there won't be any food. Here, the idea is that there's all kinds of things at the social level that are going to come into play that are going to get messed up. And so in doing that, you could talk about this in terms of losing the mandate of heaven. So somebody has some sound coming through. I don't know if that's, if somebody could, I think it might be Martin. I don't know, Martin, if you can mute yourself, or I can do that. Okay. So this is how we can understand this larger concept of the mandate of heaven in more naturalistic ways, without trying to ascribe some type of, again, divine entity here that's involved in this process. And we can see how, based on their agrarian culture, how much the observation of these patterns and how do we follow those patterns becomes central to how things happen naturally. So if we think about the debate then between the different Taos that are on offer in that Warring States period, between all these 100 schools of thought, the Taoist version of this is to say that there's at a cosmic level these patterns that are happening, and this needs to be the model that we're looking at for how we think about law within the culture, but also how we operate within it, especially from a ruler's perspective. But then what's in a sense good for the ruler is also good for the individual. It's also where we see the unique things that I think pop up in the Daodejing, stuff like that carved wood being a way of trying to unnaturally shape things to fit according to a particular agenda. The pushback for uncarved wood is to say, how do these things naturally work and how do they naturally fit together? What are the natural patterns that are happening? And this is what we need to look at if we're going to truly have a society that is not in conflict. And think of that warring states period as that backdrop that's behind all of these discussions. How do we get out of this chaos? Why are we in this chaos? So I'm going to pause here for a second because I kind of traveled through a lot of material, but I want to see what your thoughts are on this, or if the flow of the ideas is making sense to you.
It's hard to think about this without thinking about modern politics.
Yeah.
I know it's like it's the Warring States period, and that's kind of the context in which we should be thinking about this, but it's hard to not relate it to what we know. Um, so that's kind of what I'm struggling with, but also I totally get it, and I can kind of adapt it to my day-to-day life too, like a lot of, creating processes and making things work at work it's recognizing patterns, and if you try to force something to go one way but the people are kind of determining the current, and you don't go with the current, then it's you're not going to end up with a good process. You're not going to end up with a system that works, or that people want to follow. So that's kind of where I'm at. I totally agree. I think that you should recognize the patterns as they are and follow that instead of trying to force your way in or change things. Um, and also thinking about like not having favoritism. It kind of reminds me of the story about giving a mouse a cookie. Like if you let somebody do something once that's kind of outside of that system, they're gonna keep pushing that. Um, so yeah, that's just kind of what I'm toiling with. I don't think I have any questions or anything like that at the moment.
Well, I'm curious. I agree that it's practically impossible not to consider our current experience of the political system when you're going through something like this. And I think that's really a lot of the benefit for why we would wrestle with these ideas and look at these ancient texts, because they're giving us a perspective that allows us to reflect on our current situation. So I think that's a very valuable thing. What were you mentioned that you find it hard to apply this to the current political climate? In what way do you see this as problematic in that regard?
Um, Mostly with the law and people, certain people not being held, not being given the same treatment as other people. I'm trying to leave this really general,
Yeah,
if you
no,
can tell.
then that's fine because we can talk about it in terms of generalities, but we would definitely see um, some of these patterns in our own political situation of the impartiality, excuse me, the partiality, the favoritism that happens, the unequal application of the law and culture. And what do we see as the consequence of that?
uh, as far as I can tell from my limited perspective, people are upset.
Hmm.
It's kind of creating a divide in the way that the community is functioning.
Hmm.
Because some people agree because they also favor certain people, but of course, some people disagree because they agree that it should be even, it should be fair, it should be the same across the board. So I see it creating a divide.
Yeah, and this would be exactly what the Taoists are suggesting, right? That if you have that favoritism, it's going to create social conflict. And we can vouch for that from our own context. It is interesting that a lot of the concerns that they had about how the political side of things is run are very applicable to how we evaluate and critique our current political experience. That we've got people with their own ideas and their own agendas that are trying to benefit from their position of leadership. They're there more for themselves, in a sense, than for the common good, it appears. And I think sometimes even if somebody goes in with some great ideas about the common good and how they can work on those things, they can find themselves in a system that is so, in a sense, corrupt because of the influence of money and power that it can be impossible to try and accomplish any of the things that they're trying to get done. So we're going to go back to the text. So the great Tao, it says, is very smooth, but people like rough trails. So if we think about how this opened and that there is, little knowledge of the great Tao can lead to fear, we could see how this starts to play out maybe in this next line where it's suggesting that there's this pattern, there's this way that things operate. And if we pay attention to it, things run smoothly. But for some reason, people don't like to do that. They want to carve their own way, they want to go down a different road. And maybe this is what we're seeing in terms of the social chaos is the result of people failing to adhere to these larger patterns of how reality works. And we're going to see what some of the consequences are from that Taoist perspective. The government is divided. Now, this is interesting because there's a couple of different ways this line gets translated. One is something to the effect that government is in some sense dysfunctional. Here we have this idea of divided. Another way that it talks about it is that the courtyards of the public like palace and so forth is very clean, that it's very much in order, let's say. And then that gets contrasted with the fields being overgrown. So what happens? We're not paying attention to the things that are actually vital. Think of the agrarian culture. What would this mean if the fields are overgrown, if they're not tended, if they're not taken care of? Then this is a serious dilemma, especially for the masses, because it seems as though, excuse me, that centralized power is going to have ways to get access to the things that they need, but everybody else is going to suffer. And how do we see that being illustrated is that the fields are overgrown and the granaries are empty. There's not enough food. Again, this is the beginnings of how there's massive suffering that's going to be happening as a result of people taking those rough trails, not following those patterns that make up how life actually works. It says in spite of that, in spite of the fields being overgrown and the granaries being empty, somehow the nobles' clothes are gorgeous. Right. So they're walking around in pomp and circumstance, and everybody else is, struggling with lack of food and whatever else might be going wrong in society. It says their belts show off swords. Now, this could be taken in a couple of different directions. This could again be part of that decorative extravagance, or it could also be looking at how they're cracking down on legal aspects or the potential use of state sanctioned violence in order to cause people to submit to following the rules that at this point are important for the upper class that's benefiting from everything that's happening in society, even though the majority of people are suffering from this. And it says they are glutted with food and drink. So the granaries are empty, but somehow these guys still have enough for what they need. Everybody else is just having to figure out how to go without. Personal wealth is excessive. So we see this growing inequality between the different classes of people that are happening. Again, I think we can see a very strong correlation between what we have been experiencing in our own political situation, where political office has been a place to actually achieve or to gain, and it is benefiting, in a sense, the few at the expense of the many. And again, they would say that what's happening here is that they're just not paying attention to the way things actually work and what's needed if we're going to actually cultivate people. And so we're experiencing the consequences of that going out of control. Maybe I'll pause for a second and see if there's some thoughts on how this relates to our world.
It's kind of crazy to me that this was written so long ago and we're still living with these issues.
Mm.
And everybody is so aware of them. And it's just, that's the way it is.
It just keeps happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that what we're seeing is that sometimes we find ourselves as individuals feeling like we are stuck in that there isn't anything that we can do. This is just the way the system is. But going back to, in our case, let's say the birth of America, in terms of, the Western America, because obviously it was here before with the indigenous populations, that really early on with what they call the discovery of the New World was also the discovery of these indigenous folks that managed their lives very different than how it was happening in England, where you had, of course, a very stratified class system with a monarchy. And there was a move then to break away from that. How do we have something where there's more of this equality between people? And I suspect that a lot of our ideas about doing this came from our interactions with these indigenous cultures and how they structured themselves. And one of the things that's been interesting to see there is that their rulers weren't in positions that actually had power. They were almost more like figureheads that filled an office that was important for how a community can structure itself by having a point person. But that point person wasn't really there for anything other than to really promote and model the goals that the community as a whole had. And if the ruler tried to go in a different direction, the chief, they would have basically either nobody following them or they would be removed from office and so forth. And in our structuring of what we call a democracy, which is actually a constitutional republic, we can see a very similar kind of attempt at modeling a similar idea, where our Constitution is a way of defining what kind of people do we want to be. And even though it's language that we wouldn't use today, we talk about this idea of all men being created equal. This would be an example of that ideal that we're supposed to be about. And then we tried to put rules in place to really safeguard excessive power so that people had to be elected to office by the vote of the people, and that if they failed to live up to it, they could be voted out. And the system was supposed to have these checks and balances between the different divisions of government so that no one person or group could rise to really a strong power to control everybody like what we had under the monarchy. The benefit again of the Constitution is that it is something where it wasn't a true democracy. True democracy would be, essentially mob rules. But here, what we're saying is that as a constitutional republic, even a minority group could appeal to the Constitution for how we are wrestling with different laws or way things should unfold in society. And it's an amazing way of thinking about how to put this all together that in a sense is kind of a re-emergence of this older indigenous way of thinking about things, but it has some dangers in that if the people don't actually participate and if we somehow allow personal benefit to creep into the positions of rulership, then everything has the potential to come apart. And very much like what we saw in the Daodejing in terms of what we're seeing here, where you have some who are benefiting greatly from the system and the majority are going without food in the granaries and the fields are overgrown. It's a fascinating place that we find ourselves in, seeing the same type of pattern, in a sense, repeating itself. So then it's going to conclude with, this is called thieves' endowment. So all this, coalescing of that wealth with just that upper class, that 100 families, the aristocracy, they're saying it's basically, yeah, this is what happens when people are robbers. And the term for thieves or robbers is actually also pronounced Dao, which is interesting. It's a different word, but there's a lot of characters that are pronounced the same, even though they're written differently. And they have obviously very different meanings. And so it concludes by saying, yes, this is called, Tao, but it is not Tao. And I put the exclamation points there in the square brackets because the end of this line actually has two like very strong imperative type statements that aren't really translatable, but it's really showing this emphasis. It's like having the two exclamation marks there. So this is called Tao, but it is not Tao, right? Very interesting. So a lot that we covered with this one. We do have a bit of time here at the end, so I'd like to open it up to see what some people's thoughts are on this. I imagine there's got to be some ideas or some thoughts or concerns here.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said that it's kind of, a lot of us feel like we can't make a difference. And I certainly feel that way. And I don't know how to get around that, but I think it's a sentiment that a lot of people share. Like we do what we can, of course, like voting and all of that, but even with that, it just doesn't feel like it's got that oomph behind it that we want, the impact that we want to make.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Martin.
Taylor, there's plenty of things you can do as an individual. I totally know what you mean in terms of feeling that we have no impact. And I find that it's a matter of defining where is your sphere of influence, what can you individually do. And as a man, I find that a lot in terms of the fight for feminism, that I need to talk to my fellow men. I need to talk about the people that I have impact on and make the change that I want to see in the world. And activism of any level and volunteering of any level, I found gives me the biggest sense of hope and applicability, or a sense of I actually do make a difference in this world of despair of, oh my God, there's so much that I have zero control over, and it's frustrating watching the news, let alone be impacted by the news or the changes in the world ourselves. So if I can just throw those two lifelines, maybe hopefully to you, to look at activism, and it can be as small as you want, it can be as big as you want it to be, and it can mean just talking to your friends about the changes you want to see in the world. Talk to your group friends and say, you know what, folks, this is gonna impact me or my family and my loved ones. We need to talk about that. We need to have a conversation about how do you all feel about that, and maybe let them change their mind or have them speak their mind and have a conversation about where do you want the world around you to go. I find that very difficult. For example, when it comes to politics, I have my friend group is very politically aligned. We all kind of vote the same way, but for different reasons. And oftentimes, I find that living in Calgary, we are a very we are very one party leaning area here. It's hard to find people who would want to vote the other way, and kind of springing the conversation and showing them the importance of those topics to you, or perhaps to them as well, bring them to the ability and willingness to go and vote. But even if it's not about voting, if it's about just I'm invested in food insecurity, and just going out and doing some volunteering, going and getting some food, spending my privileged money that I have, my disposable income that I can, that others don't have, and providing for others, that's very fulfilling, very anchoring in the sense of being lost in the space of so much happening around me, that grounds me and says, you know what, you've made a difference for this person in this day. This person can now have a food on their table today, even if they didn't have anything to eat the whole day today. So it's not all lost. There are small things that we can do, and I totally hear you. I've been where you've been not too long ago myself. Um, find the small things that you can do. There is plenty.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like volunteering is definitely one of the best ways to cope with that. It's still hard to feel like if you look at how many volunteer opportunities there are, how often we need it, it's also the thought behind that of like
Mm-hmm.
why why aren't the leaders doing more? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
100%.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, 100%. I was agreeing.
Mm. Yeah, I think we've allowed a situation to develop where we've allowed, in a sense, real power and personal benefit to creep back into politics. And that's a very difficult thing to unwind, because once somebody has power, they're not necessarily going to want to give it up. The other thing that is challenging is, you know, we can be tempted to think that the way that we can really affect change is to get that power for ourselves. But what we've seen time and time again is that that doesn't work. Um, as soon as one of these groups receives a seat at the table, they find themselves just as much then a slave to that system, or caught up in that personal benefit that makes it very difficult to figure out how to continue what maybe the initial goals were. So I love this term. It was kind of taken over by somebody else, but I wish I would have thought of it first. But it's this idea of overgrowing the system, that it's not this idea as much about how do we, take over the system and put it on the right track, because things are at a structural level really problematic, that there has to be a way at a more massive layer, at that maybe that grassroots layer to be able to start to live life differently that almost is independent of what's happening at those higher levels. And if we can figure some of those things out, it can have a massive impact even at those higher levels. And definitely how we, again, become more participatory in the system is going to be key. But I think for a lot of people, because of the financial situation we find ourselves in, we're so busy just trying to figure out how to survive, it can feel daunting to take on one more thing, especially something that feels like we don't have any chance of succeeding in. But to Martin's point, as we've talked about before with this idea of chaos theory, what's interesting is that the little things matter, and the little things can build up over time and start to have a significant impact. And we've seen significant changes happening in our world in spite of power, where massive social adjustments have happened. One of the key ones that's very easy to look at that happened very rapidly, at least in the US, was how the openness to same-sex marriages really changed. It seemed like almost overnight. And I believe this was much more of kind of a groundswell movement that happened, as well as some of our entertainment doing a lot to help us to understand from somebody else's perspective. And once people were able to gain that perspective, it allowed for some pretty massive change to happen in a pretty short period of time. Another one that we see happening right now is something like the legalization of marijuana, for example. This has been just kind of a staggering change that's been happening across the country, both at the state levels and then going into, more of the federal level as well. So it's not impossible for changes to happen, but part of what we have to get clear on is what is actually needed to make the more significant changes. So yes, we've adjusted some of these laws that have made different aspects at a social level better, but there's the bigger problem still of how do we get the benefit of public office out? How do we get in a sense, the money out of politics? And that's probably our biggest challenge right now, because whereas before, ideally, it was, one person, one vote. Now it's essentially $1, one vote. And so those with lots of dollars are making a lot of decisions for how things should happen. And of course, they're voting for their own self-interest. So I would just suggest that that's probably the first place we need to look at, is how do we get the money out of politics? And not an easy thing. In the US, we've got that Citizens United that there's different groups working on, and how do we get that overturned, that essentially allowed corporations to function like individuals in terms of how they do contributions. So not something we can solve at one point, but again, I just find it fascinating how much this ancient text speaks so much to the similar situations that we're still wrestling with, and I think provides some really interesting insights into how we evaluate and interpret the situation we find ourselves in. Thank you for being here today. If you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get emails with our latest videos, as well as a link to this Zoom conversation that happens on Friday mornings, as well as where we meet in person on Sunday mornings if you happen to be in the Southern California area. So with that, I want to thank again everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jim. Great job again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.